We continue to bring you reaction to the postponement of the budget speech. Joining us now for
postponement of the budget speech.
That the budget was postponed and that government would have further discussions and table a new budget on the 12th of March.
Well, the postponement of budget today has rendered Parliament useless. It has got no authority because budget, whether you agree on it or not, you must bring it here so that it can be debated and ultimately adopted.
Greetings to the people of South Africa, diaspora, and all of those who are tuning in from across the world. My name is Tambo. I'm the national spokesperson of the Economic Freedom Fighters, and today we have a very special edition of the EFF podcast. I'm joined by esteemed minds in economics today as a panel, following, of course, what can be described as a hectic week for South Africa of a budget that never was. And immediately to my left, I'm joined by UJ Professor and the Director for the Center for Social Change, Patrick Bond. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Comrade.
Prof. Patrick Bond, or Comrade, whichever we prefer. And we're also joined by Tshidi Lencoasa, sorry. Tshidi Lencoasa, who's a budget analyst and a budget researcher as well. Welcome to you. And of course, we're joined by a familiar face, Duma Gqubule, an independent economist. Welcome once again to the EFF podcast.
Thank you so much.
So let's get straight to it, guys. It's been a hectic week for South Africa. For the first time since 1994, we've seen a budget being postponed as a result of disputes within the Government of National Unity, which of course we know is constituted by about 10 political parties, but two main coalition partners, which are the DA and the ANC. Perhaps let's start with you, Patrick. What did you make of it? I mean, what were your expectations ahead of the budget? We know there's been a lot of policy disagreements within the GNU, and the budget seems to have been a place of clashing that they're unable to get past. What did you make of it? What were your expectations? And did you expect the trouble that you came into?
I didn't expect that trouble from inside, since some of it comes from a neoliberal party, the Democratic Alliance, but the squeezing of poor and working class people has been absolutely relentless since 2020. An 18.1% cut in state spending per person, reflecting the International Monetary Fund's pressure to run a fiscal surplus, that is to not run any deficit aside from that on the loan side, repaying loans. But second, that there is only, let's say, occasional opposition to austerity in very specific sector by sector ways that began to come together on Wednesday when a protest that included the different factions of progressives in South Africa, the liberal constitutionalist progressives, Keynesians and reformers on the one hand, and the centre-left, the big trade unions, and then the independent left, the socialists in SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, its allies, the cry of the excluded. So you sort of begin to feel that a coalition of radical civil society could be a pressure point, not just the internecine fighting in the GNU, which is, it's a chaotic time, and there are lots of areas where the GNU has split, so there should be kind of wedges to show the differences. But I was surprised that it was on a simple matter like the Treasury, as maybe usual, not consulting and squeezing poor people through raising the value-added tax.
Yeah. Tshidi, what did you make of it? I mean, there's a proposed 2%, rumor has it that there's a proposed 2% hike in the value-added tax. I mean, what did you make of it? What do you think how would that impact ordinary people? I mean, it's something that mobilized all of society. I mean, Patrick is correct. No one would have thought that the EFF and, for example, the DA would agree, for example, on rejecting the hike to VAT. So what did you make of it?
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks for the opportunity. And I speak, I'm a budget analyst, but within civil society, and I'll just continue what Patrick was talking about radical civil society coming up, is that for years we had been warning and cautioning. In fact, the Budget Justice Coalition, the genesis of it came from the initial VAT hike in 2018. And as civil society, for a long time, it was pitted against, education versus health versus basic education versus higher education. We saw during Fees Must Fall. But this moment, when it was a VAT increase, we knew that is ultimate austerity. And as civil society, we have to come together, and not just as civil society, but as a country, we need to come together and unite behind, rather than gaining power and fighting over power, but really just uniting over a common cause of what's in the best interest of the people of this country. How can we actually build a nation using our fiscal policy? So when we saw, we were in the budget lockup, so we get, we're embargoed and we see the statement. And when I saw that 2% hike, like my heart just dropped, because I just anticipated social upheaval, because we know that life is so hard in South Africa already. Poverty rates are so persistent. Unemployment is so persistent in our country, and it really is the most marginalized people who bear the burden of this, contrary to who gets the voice. Maybe in the mainstream media, it's usually certain voices or people who have certain privileges to be able to speak, but the everyday South African is really shouldering the burden of this weak economic growth and these decisions that are being made. So it is quite disheartening.
Absolutely. I think all of us, I was also in the lockup. I'm a member of parliament. I think my heart sank because I couldn't believe it that they would actually proceed with it. Duma, I saw a tweet of yours that morning saying that you don't think that they would actually make such a stupid decision, but knowing Treasury of South Africa, anything is possible. What did you make of it? The increase itself, but also perhaps explain to our listeners, because a lot of economic terminologies tends to be a bit dense for the ordinary person. What actually is VAT? How does it impact the ordinary person? And what other options possibly could there have been to try and increase revenue collection in South Africa?
Yeah, it was actually a shocker for me now. And VAT is a tax. It's 15% now. It's 15% now. It's a across the board tax on all consumption that you do, and it has a disproportionate effect on poorer people. But back to why I was shocked about this, because I thought it's not going to happen. Yeah, and the reason for that, let me just say some background. This is about Treasury incompetence, and I think South Africans need to understand that. From 2009 to 2024, average GDP growth 1.1%. The average for emerging markets, 155 countries, 4.4%. Emerging and developing Asia, about 6.3%. So a rising debt ratio is the side order. It's a symptom of an economy that doesn't grow. So the debt ratio and the debt service cost, these are just symptoms of an economy that doesn't grow. So the real solution is to get the economy to grow. Obviously, we need the quality of growth to benefit all the people. And I just want to say, the reason I didn't expect this is that I read the budget reviews. So if you read the one in 2024, they say, so Tshidi was talking about the 2018 VAT increase by Malusi Gqubule. So what they said after that from 2020 is that we don't agree with this. We didn't raise as much revenue as we thought we would. And then they start saying every single budget since then, we're opposed to VAT tax increases because they were almost traumatized that this thing didn't work. So if you work backwards, 2024, they say, no, we're not going to go. Last year, they say we're not going to increase taxes because it's a weak economy. It has feedback, GDP growth lower and tax revenues lower. That's basic economics. So that's what they were saying. And in 2023, they cited two studies by UN which showed that, and then that it has a negative impact on the economy and on GDP growth. The same in 2022, 2021, and they say since 2020, we are not in favor of tax. Now, what on earth made them do this? Because if in the budget now, they say the VAT will increase by 60 billion, 180 billion. But we know that the economy is weak. Their forecast of 1.8% growth, Treasury routinely doesn't meet the forecasts because the forecasts are too optimistic. So this year we're going to be 0.5, last year 0.5, 0.7. So how are we going to get to 1.9 GDP growth? We won't meet it, so that's what I'm trying to say. So then there'll be a revenue shortfall next year so what I'm trying to say is that to me, it made no sense whatsoever. It's against Treasury's what they've been saying over the past 5 years. So it's about incompetence. Sorry, this organization's got too much power. It's got more power than the president.
Treasury, that is.
Yeah, Treasury. It's got more power than the president. And I've been documenting my writing in the media about they cancel everything the president says. Now, my view of the president is that he believes that he's not competent enough to adjudicate on economic policy issues, and he defers to Treasury. So that's my view on it. But Treasury, they have cancelled most of the things that he says will do. I'll give you an example, 2 examples. September 2018, he says, I'm going to have a 400 billion rand infrastructure fund. February 2019, the infrastructure fund is now 100 billion. Fast forward, it was announced in SONA, the 100 billion infrastructure fund that the president talked about again 6 years later. 6 years later, not 1 cent in that fund. In April 2020, he says we're going to have a 500 billion rand stimulus. I followed that stimulus. Treasury cancelled the stimulus. And there was no contribution from the government. The contributions came from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and it came from the loan guarantee scheme. So that is about 80 billion rand. So what I'm trying to say, they've got more power than ministers. And Malusi Kigaba was ostensibly a RET minister, and he goes and implements what the Treasury officials say. And I just think it's an amazing situation. I know that Gqubule did his PhD on the Treasury, and it's also undemocratic. The ANC in their manifesto, they said they want 2.5 million work opportunities through public employment. Weeks later, in the budget, soon after that, the budget 2024 cuts public employment by 14 billion rands. And so I'm just saying that this organization has gone rogue, and we have to check it. Its power must be, and this is where, so they arrive in Parliament like they always do. It's never a problem. They don't tell their own ANC cabinet, I'm talking about before the GNU, the government of neoliberal unity, they don't tell their own cabinet ministers what's going to be in the budget. So they arrive there as usual. Nothing has changed in their mind. We're not going to tell them what's in the budget until the day of the budget, And then things are different now. There's other parties, And the arrogance for me was just incredible. They were this is how they roll for the past 15 years. They don't consult anyone. They're unaccountable, and we have to rein in the power of this national treasury. Yeah,
absolutely. Look, I think to speak to that arrogance, Patrick, and since you spoke on austerity, if you read the budget speech, of course, it's publicly available now and on all social media platforms, so we're not doing anything illegal when we deliberate on it. He National Treasury ring fences us to like 3 options that they had with regards to increasing revenue collection. It's either they continue to cut funding to essential services which benefit the people, which I found quite ironic because they've been denying implementing austerity for years, and only now to say that they've actually been doing it. So that was one of the options, whether they continue to cut that funding or not. Or the other option that they stated that they have is that they continue to take on expensive debt. Now we know our debt service costs already are almost on 400 million a year, almost $1 billion a day. 400 billion a year, almost $1 billion a day. So, and then the third option, of course, was to make strategic tax adjustments. Those are the 3 options that he ring fences us to. Do you think that naturally that actually they're correct to say that the increase in value-added tax is the only option we had to increase revenue of the state, or are there other options? Because I know that we as the EFF, of course, have been speaking about increasing corporate tax, introducing a wealth tax. Is that not a viable option? Are we really dependent on taxing the poor in order to create more revenue for the state?
Oh, I entirely agree. And just think that corporate tax was 51.5%. under apartheid, 1992. And then President Mandela worked in his office in his first months, was under extraordinary pressure to send signals to the markets, as they said, and get the confidence, and there'd be commitments of reinvestment by big business if they had a lower tax. And it never happened. He took it to 39, and now Minister Odious a couple of years ago has got it now down to 27, and if you're in a special economic zone, 15. So those incredibly low rates. Now they'll say, well, the whole world is 27, so Donald Trump is cutting even further very soon. But what if we had tighter exchange controls? You could keep the money in the country, could retain business earnings, but tax them higher. And that would be the most crucial thing. Also on that debt, as you say, it's so high, and it's partly because domestic debt and foreign debt, but especially domestic, carries that high interest rate. So you can bring the interest rate down. Again, you need to have exchange controls to prevent the capital flight. And of course, the most important, so much of that debt, the 400 billion repayment, the trillions, is actually odious debt. That is to say, under international legal doctrine, it was contracted by a state, not with the will of the people, when it's corrupt. And we know so much, even though Donald Trump is about to get rid of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The single biggest loan that we've ever had, and the biggest loan the World Bank ever made, was for the Matshidiso coal-fired power plant, and that was Hitachi, the Japanese company, giving Chancellor House, the African National Congress financing wing, a quarter share, as they got these vast contracts. They couldn't do them very well, as you know. We had to redo lots of Madupi. But Vali Musa, the then chair of ESCOM, was also on the ANC Finance Committee meeting. And when I was in Kenya last June, I could hear the comrades, the Gen Z comrades, saying, debt audit. What is going on with this huge new foreign debt that they were subject to, especially Chinese loans on a corrupt big railroad? And I think that's what we need, don't you? I mean, it's basically to look at why are we paying such high interest rates with very, call it state-monetarist economic policies in the Reserve Bank. Not only the Treasury, right? I think you two would agree that the monetary policy is also needing a full rehab. But also, what is the corrupt character of the debt? Can't we question it?
Look, it's true, because also I think internally in the EFF we've had that reflection that what exactly are we servicing in terms of this debt? We've taken on so much debt as a nation, but we're repaying it and we're not actually seeing the fruits of it. So where does it go? I'm not saying we need a Department of Government Efficiency in South Africa like the US has done, but certainly for the high levels of debt that we have, there should be some questions and some sort of interrogation as to where actually has it gone to, what are we servicing?
Well, and credit to the EFF, because I think you've raised questions like Transnet and how those locomotive deals with the Chinese were full of Gupta-related bonsalas, those acts of corruption. And there are lenders like the China Development Bank, the World Bank, BRICS Bank, lots of Western banks, US agencies and European credit agencies. I think we should be asking them to come to a Nuremberg on why they finance corrupt projects that they knew were corrupt. We know the World Bank had every indication. Even the DA said, don't make the loans to Madupi. It'll just be corruption money.
Look, Tshidi, maybe to touch on this, I know that it's a very VAT-centric discussion around the budget. We'll get to other topics as well. I'm not sure if you've seen, there was a hot mic with the Minister of Finance and the Minister in the Presidency, Nkosi, where they were sort of reflecting on when is the SARS Commission actually leaving. And a lot of that is rooted around the fact that SARS actually disagrees with the tax hikes of VAT. And they were proposing, if my memory serves me correctly, that there must actually be an increase in allocation to SARS so that it can sort of make more competent its revenue collection systems, and that could get them about 800 billion in revenue if they get a more allocation to modernize their systems, as opposed to increasing VAT. What do you make of that? Do you think that SARS is correct, that could be a better method than actually taxing the people?
Yeah, I think it's so important that you bring that up because, again, just to allude to the BJC's activism in civil society, for years there have been conversations around our tax base and how much money are we actually getting in revenues and how many leakages there are in the system. There has been advocacy around illicit financial flows in our country and outflows from South Africa. I mean, you know, similar to the rest of the continent in that issue. And there have been issues also with just talking about how as a country, you know, everybody's feeling so overburdened by with regards to our taxes. We're so taxed out, and the reason for that is because, for the most part, the everyday person is bearing that burden. So the working class person, everybody, you know, is contributing to our fiscus, except there are a few people who, through illicit financial flows or feeling that they're above the law of some sort, are not actually contributing their fair share. So civil society has been rallying around you know, how do we strengthen our revenue collection to ensure that everybody pays and contributes fairly? Because when we don't, then we end up in situations, or it's made even worse or more pronounced in this context that, yes, we need funding, resources for education, for health, for all of that. But that's, you know, that's just that should have been a last resort intervention. And I think that it was really important to bring this point up, because then just seeing that hot mic and seeing how it unfolded and the the reaction of National Treasury and all of governments against this, like what the SARS boss had been saying, was just really disheartening, because those are valid points and conversation that we've been having as a country also. We know that there are illicit financial flows. We see it. I mean, we see it on social media. We see how people are flashing around like money that isn't taxed. We see, that comes up in the news all the time, but we're just surprised to see that government wouldn't take this urgently, because this is something that could actually be a way to move past and also increase in confidence in our country, and say, oh, this country actually has strong systems in terms of how there aren't any leakages. They're very serious about nation building, but the reaction that government showed yesterday, it was really disappointing for us.
Absolutely. Maybe Duma, to jump onto that, what are your thoughts on SARS proposal? But I think also additionally, maybe to take it a bit to a political route as well. What do we think the actual underlying factors are behind the disagreement in the GNU? Because I think that, for example, there's the proposal by the Minister of Finance is that the increase in VAT is to ensure that there's more allocation of money for the revitalization of the rail network, for social grants, and for the increase in the civil service public wage. So that was sort of the logic that the minister puts forward, that we need to increase VAT in order to be able to subsidize these programs that are beneficial to the people. Would the DA be disagreeing on that basis? But let me not...
No, the DA disagrees on different bases to us. So I just want to say there's something very important you touched on, these false choices that the Minister of Finance was talking about. He says it's either we borrow more, or we cut spending, or we increase taxes. Now, our economy is in a terrible situation. I would argue that tax increases, except for the wealthy and the illicit financial flows, should be off the table, number one. Cutting spending should be off the table. Debt, now this is their favorite tactic, fear-mongering around debt. Japan, 250%. Singapore, 176% of GDP. Advanced economies, 109% of GDP. The world average, 93% of GDP. Egypt, 91% of GDP. China, 90% of GDP, a fast-growing economy. Brazil, 88% of GDP. India, 83%. G20 emerging markets, 75%. So there's no universe in which South Africa has a high debt ratio. And I have to repeat this again. The reason for the high debt ratio is Treasury incompetence that's failing to grow the economy. Because these are ratios, debt to GDP, debt service to GDP. So if you're not growing the bottom part of the equation, it's going to increase. So all these measurements as a percentage of GDP, they're meaningless because it's just inevitable because the economy is not growing. Now, in terms of so what we need over the next 3 weeks until March 12th, I think the finance minister should resign. There shouldn't be a compromise around the VAT. So the VAT must no 2%. It must be cancelled, and we must have a growth budget. Now, where will the money come from? People ask, and when people ask me this, I start with the unemployment insurance fund surplus. Now, before COVID, we were discussing like at NEDLAC. I go to NEDLAC sometimes and talk. There was the discussion around the surplus of. In fact, it starts in 2016 when an economist called Niva Makgetla, she raises this. There's this at TIPS. There's this unemployment insurance fund surplus of more than 100 billion rands, and we could perhaps use to stimulate the economy. And then fast forward to COVID, the Treasury couldn't come up with a reason why we have this surplus. So we paid out of that kitty 60 billion rands for 13.8 million people to their income to support them during COVID. Now, I looked in the budget yesterday. There is still 137 billion rand in that kitty. So we are arguing, for example, that we need to increase our public employment programs, the 3 ones that we have, and fund them through a big allocation from that 137 billion and also from the employment tax incentive, which is wasteful, which is a social security for rich companies. So it's 7 billion rands a year. So we come with all these proposals that I'm just giving you have got nothing to do with increasing borrowing. Number 2, the government employees pension fund. I was doing calculations based on the budget yesterday. They have accumulated since 2012 surpluses of 645 billion rands. This is in the last year, 2023-24, 58 billion rands. Now, what is the reason for those surpluses? Now, the funding in the Government Employees Pension Fund is 400 billion rand above the target that was set by the trustees. So we're talking about surpluses of 645, excess funding of 400 billion rands, and the PIC, the government owes the PIC 800 billion rands debt. So of this 5 trillion rand debt, 800 billion is to the government itself. It's, intergovernment debt. So what I'm trying to say is that there's no reason why we need those surpluses. We can cut the assets. So I'm proposing a one-off, and we also have foreign exchange reserves, 1.2 trillion. So the PIC has got 3 trillion, foreign exchange reserves 1.2 trillion, 4.2 trillion, and then there's cash in the budget, usually 150 billion rands. So what I'm trying to say is that even before we go to the bond market, there are resources that we can tap into to within the family, as it were, to finance the stimulus. Now, what is a growth budget? A growth budget, we are now, the forecast, let's say it's 1.5 billion, 1.5%. And the target that we should do, unemployment is my major issue that I talk about, but I haven't talked about it yet, and this unemployment crisis. We need a growth rate of 6% to get the, to make inroads into unemployment. So what does it mean practically? It means that the government spending has a multiplier effect. So there's a paper that came out recently by a Brazilian, late 2023, Brazilian economist called Dante Cardoso and his friends and his colleagues. They found that 42 countries, the multiplier effect of social protection spending is about 1. It was very high in many countries, like Brazil was 4.7. They were high. So we brought him in, an organization that I worked for called Social Policy Initiative, and he did it for South Africa. So we found that social protection spending has got a multiplier of 1.6. So you spend into the economy, and you get you spend R1 billion, 1.6 billion comes back. So if there's a multiplier and there's a positive multiplier, it stimulates economies in Tembisa, in Soweto, in Guguletu. People don't keep the money under the mattress. It stimulates our economy. So if there's a multiplier, there should be no question about can we pay for it. And I was using an analogy to my colleague Isabel. I said, your daughter's just gone to UCT. Now imagine that the fees are 100,000 rands at UCT. And if you pay these fees, you're going to get 160,000 back. That is how it works. That's the analogy. So you'd be stupid not to pay the fees. So as a country, we have to invest in this budget on March 12th. We have to invest in our people, social security. We have to invest in our infrastructure. The budget says that the multiplier of construction spending is 1.9 times. And if you spend R1 billion and it creates jobs, I think they tell you how many jobs it creates, and for people who don't have education, matric. And then the third thing, we have to build our public service. I was talking to Tshidi earlier on about the shortages. I just got statistics from the Department of Public Service about our health service. We've got 20,000 doctors for about 53 million people. To reach OECD benchmarks, I calculated we need about 150,000 new doctors. Nurses, I haven't done the analysis, but it was less than 200,000 for 53 million people. This is the population that depends on the public service. So to reach OECD benchmarks, we need about 300,000 nurses, So those are the three things I want to see on March 12th. They must have a growth budget. So the finance minister must go because he's incapable of thinking in a mindset that requires a growth budget. Number two, in terms of, so I think all the parties in parliament, that's what they should unite around: the resignation of the minister, cancel the 2% VAT, and a growth budget on March 12th.
I think we'll definitely take you up on the first one, on the resignation. Patrick, Duma speaks about a need for more investment in public infrastructure, and I think it's a segue to the next part of the budget that I think we should touch on, because there's been a lot of emphasis on what is called Operation Vulindlela in terms of the budget, a program that's been rolled out over the past couple of years, which essentially speaks to opening up our state-owned enterprises to private partnerships. So an arrangement where sort of the generation of electricity, for example, and distribution at Eskom is handled by the private sector, the operations of our railway network, of our ports Do you think this is a wise strategy, that in order for us to sort of create jobs, to be able to generate revenue, to invest into public infrastructure, that we invite more private sector participation? I mean, we're not completely opposed to it. Of course, it must be guided. But the approach of Operation Vulindlela seems to be code word for privatization. Your thoughts on that?
Selling the family jewels, that's right. And it's a PPP, but public-private pilfering, sometimes public-private plundering model, the way we've seen it operate. And that doesn't change all that much from the Zuma to Ramaphosa era. And we've seen, for example, a failed attempt to privatize part of the urban at Queenie Port, and many, many other areas where there's, let's say, a limit to what, in US dollar terms, 30% rates of return will get you. And the question of whether just rebuilding railroads, especially where there's been cable theft or just failure to maintain, shouldn't require a PPP partner. I did a big study of this with Professor Greg Graters from UWC School of Government last year, and we went through all of them, and they really have never had a PPP success story. And I do worry that the kinds of people managing this process, for example, privatizing the ocean, Operation Pakisa, you might have seen, they're the likes of McKinsey. Now, McKinsey's so bad that President Ramaphosa actually told the business unity South Africa, when they were doing the B20, the Business 20, not to use McKinsey. And it's that extent, let's say, of these consultants, I always get that wrong, these consultants from the big Western companies, you know, these big guys that parachute in and more or less say the same thing, copy and paste. And I think we have to get rid of that PPP mentality and figure out what basics can be done. I just mentioned this B20 because the next week, G20 has a finance ministers meeting. And the attention, of course, is on the extent to which the US is in. Yeah. It won't be because Scott Bessent, the finance minister, the Treasury secretary, has just said he's pulling out, like Marco Rubio has pulled out of the current foreign ministers meeting. And that, I think, gives us a chance to re-evaluate South Africa's relationship to, let's say, world elite politics. And if it is, I think you two would agree, the International Monetary Fund squeezing the international credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch and Moody's, squeezing. And if it's an opportunity now to question that, if indeed Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana hasn't resigned by the time he hosts the finance ministers in Cape Town in the middle of next week, well, I hope there are going to be some loud voices saying, G20, maybe first get rid of the United States presence. They clearly don't want to be around. Donald Trump's dropping out of climate talks and World Health Organization, trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza. No space for US in the G20. And I think that's the signaling that we really do need a change that we began to see Tuesday at Central Methodist Church, Wednesday in the March, and now with this, let's say, turmoil in cabinet, perhaps a chance to really put pressure on some of the sites at the world economy level, those finance ministers and all of their mates that really are doing such damage here.
Yeah, Tshidi, maybe your thoughts on that. Does South Africa's fiscal policy rely too much on foreign direct investment? Is there an over-reliance on private sector participation? But maybe on this G20 aspect, I mean, we've seen over the past couple of weeks in Donald Trump's short presidency how his foreign policy, he wants it to be sort of some imperial policy where everyone must toe the line, or there's going to be tariffs, there's going to be sanctions, there's going to be cutting off of US aid, for example. Is it wise that our fiscal policy is so, because the Minister of Finance also says in his speech that if we increase corporate tax or introduce a wealth tax, it will scare away investors. And this has sort of been the premise of the Government of National Unity, that they're going to create growth, they're going to create economic stability on the basis of boosting investor confidence. Do you think this has happened to the GNU? Do you think it's a wise approach to inform fiscal and economic policy? Your thoughts, maybe?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's good to ask me, as in civil society and, you know, Section 27, we've definitely observed the impacts that the executive orders that Trump has made has had already. I think maybe people have already started to see the NGO sector like decrying this because of the impact that it would have on particularly, you know, health outcomes in a country with the HIV prevalence that we do, and there had been support from US intervention. And I think that, you know, yes, we're definitely in a crisis mode right now, but I think that, you know, me being in a civil society space, I have been observing what the wider public has been saying and how they've been reacting to it. I think that many people were shocked to know that the extent to which foreign governments have been funding our HIV response, for example, it would have made sense maybe in 2003 when PEPFAR had started, but it has been, it has been long, like it has been decades since then. And I think there is a call now for a conversation around, should we be building, actually asking the question of how do we actually build a nation? Are we adequately in our fiscal policy, the way that we are responding to it? I mean, I think Duma is mentioning this is not a growth foregrounded fiscal policy. Is that the kind of budget that is actually going to put us in a trajectory where we can be an independent country that can stand and not be swayed by what's happening internationally? Because again, to bring back to the everyday South African, we have no say in American politics. They have their democratic processes. We cannot vote or have a say. And so to know that there could be a reaction based on what we don't have control over, and it could impact our human rights is deeply concerning. And so I do think that there's a lot happening now. We are really in unprecedented times. So much has happened, and it's only February this year. But I think that, it's actually pretty crazy. But I think that, I really would like to call everyone to say, for the past, since 94, I think we've been coasting and pausing things and saying, oh, the crisis is bad. There's persistent youth unemployment. Okay, it's bad, and then we keep moving. But now we're realizing that we need to react, not just even react, but be proactive if we are going to secure the futures of the people in this country.
Absolutely. I mean, shockingly, it's only February. One would forget that. Duma, I think maybe let's. Of course, I'm sure you want to chip in on that.
It's my favorite one.
Yeah.
There's two things. If you go to the budget any year for the past 2 decades, and you look at the smallest component of infrastructure spending, it's usually less than 2% of spending. It's PPPs. They've been doing it and changing them for 2 decades. That's the first thing. The second thing, structural reform started in the budget in 2012. No, the economy has grown by less than 1% a year since these structural reforms started. Now, why these structural reforms make no sense whatsoever? I'll use the example of health. We've got roughly 250 billion rand spending in medical aids. This is 16% of the population. But only 22% of them have got full medical cover. So the medical aid system caters for 3% of the population. Why is that the situation? Because this structural reform, private sector participation, it's based on the sense that they will extract from South Africans. But markets are designed to extract from prime customers. But 80% of South Africans are subprime. We can't afford to pay for energy. We can't afford to pay for rail, water, communications, where these structural reforms happen. So now, why Operation Vulindlela is such a nonsensical project is that it hinges on one sector, energy, renewable energy. Everything else is incidental, in terms of the amount. And every few months, I add everything that Operation Vulindlela is doing. 80 to 90% is in energy, and it is spare change within the context of an 8 trillion rands economy. The structural reforms don't add up to much in the economy. So to summarize, to finalize, I believe in state participation in education, health, no private sector. I believe we must take profit out of education and health. I don't believe in private schools or healthcare, although my son, eventually he was in a public school and came back from Eastern Europe, and we put him in a public school, and he cried for a month, until we. But anyway, but the point what I'm trying to say is that I am totally opposed to private healthcare, private education, and the same in energy. Yeah. I'll just talk about Eskom. They are privatizing everything to do with Eskom. They wanted to privatize the power stations. They want to privatize the transmission grid. Again, we don't have the money to pay. Middle-class families can't pay for these energy bills. We need to subsidize these energy bills. And so I believe in the public option for energy, I don't believe in any private sector. If I was in charge, I was the president, I would cancel all the IPPs and have a public option. I would have a public company to invest in these renewables, and I've calculated it would be about 2% of GDP a year that we invest from the public purse to provide cheap energy to our people. Because all you're doing here is extracting the private companies trying to extract the maximum from our people. So I think, no, I don't believe in private participation in rail, in energy, in water. They're now having water IPPs. But they're going to service the prime customers, and the rest of the society, as I showed in health, will not be able to afford these services. So it makes no sense. Because even if you add all these investments, the investments don't add up to much. And I do this analysis every few months. So I don't understand why they keep repeating this drum of Operation Vulindlela when it's easier to just for the government to spend the money. You know, in a previous life, lastly, I was working as an advisor on a PPP with the police. It was so complicated. It went on for months and months and months. And then I talked to the people. I said, why don't you just build the bloody thing, you know? The whole thing, it was so complicated, what you have to do. The private sector, they threaten you, they want this, they want this, they want this, and it takes longer than it should. It's cheaper for the government just to spend the money and build the head office of the police here.
Absolutely. Look, Patrick, perhaps in closing, because I mean we could talk all day about the budget that didn't come. Politically, do you think that perhaps there's what has happened in this past week has left room for opportunism for the budget to be used to resolve sort of political and policy disputes within the GNU? Because a lot of commentary has been around that now the DA has finally stood its ground. It has been able now to assert itself after ostensibly or assumingly losing debates around the Bella Act, the NHI Act, and the Expropriation Act. The budget has been hung over our heads by Helen Zille a couple of weeks ago, that let's see what happens with the budget. Do you think this was a political ploy? Do you think the DA is genuinely against the VAT? Not that I'm asking you to condemn it, of course, but just in your own analysis, is it dangerous for the people of South Africa that the budget could possibly be used as a negotiation tool about disputes about the policy in South Africa?
Well, there's that danger. In fact, the term "a fight between hostile brothers" sometimes comes up. And that reflects that the Ramaphosa ANC, which could have moved to EFF and to MK Party for its coalition partners, instead moved to the right in June last year. And it reminded me of this budget squabble, of another moment when President Ramaphosa had to reverse then Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. It was when there were a 350 rand grant for 18 to 60-year-olds during COVID. In May 2021, Mboweni got rid of that. And in July, riots that really, not just KZN, bits of Gauteng, but really shook the society. And what Ramaphosa did was to reinstate that against the wishes of not just Mboweni, but the IMF. Those are the sorts of, let's say, moments where more durable politics than this elite internecine battling should be looked at. And I hope what the EFF and other progressive forces will do is figure out whether all of our micro protests that are underway, in Melville and Johannesburg, even a petty bourgeois suburb is protesting over water cuts. But electricity, the load reduction continues even though there's not load shedding. Yeah. There's all sorts of new ways that to squeeze the municipalities in turn to squeeze poor people. Treasury is really putting, I think, politics from above in danger of a rebellion from below. I've seen that many times in this country, and we've seen a fees must fall rise up and overthrow a policy which was not to have free education for working class people. I've seen it with the AIDS policy, where protests that the Treatment Action Campaign arranged not only overthrew President Thabo Mbeki's, some would say, genocidal policies, but actually raised life expectancy from 52 to 65. We can credit activists with that. And we've seen service delivery protests change and get the services back. So I think it's with, maybe I could call it uncivil society, that we'll find much more durable. And the question is, what will spark them? Will it be this threat of a 2% VAT? Will it be the technical information that people like us provide? Or will it just be the hurtful sense that this government of national unity isn't for them?
Tshidi, I think, perhaps let me ask you in closing as well, Do you expect any changes fundamentally to the budget from the one that, of course, we're in possession of now and the one that will be delivered on the 12th of March 2025? Because, for example, I think there might be a consensus reached around 1% VAT increase. So this might be some brokemanship that is being done between the ANC and the DA. And of course, I think that they might envision that 1% might be something that South Africans might accept, or it might be more palatable to them. So they pitch 2% in order to land on 1%. That's just the pessimist in me, I'd say. But your thoughts, what would you like to see different in the budget that will be introduced on the 12th of March, and your thoughts about what to anticipate?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you'd asked me last year, my view definitely when it comes to the budget is that budget process takes time and it's inch by inch before we see huge changes. But then with everything that has unfolded, and also I think even just internationally, I think people have seen with the executive orders with Trump, and obviously, you know, being on the other side, we've seen just how quickly government, I think we're relearning and testing the boundaries of like what government can and cannot do, what parliament can and cannot do, what the budget process can actually look like. I mean, I would be so disappointed if the budget would look similar and it wasn't human rights based, it wasn't growth based. After all of that, what happened yesterday, because that was also costly. That also cost having a budget speech and the way that it was, and in its fancy ways in Cape Town and flying all those people there, that cost money. So if this is a political ploy, it would be really disappointing. And so I'm trying to keep hopeful, because I think that we just hope, and we will as civil society continue to put out ways to show that a better budget is possible, and it is possible to have a human rights based budget, and a budget that is by the people, for the people, and one that actually has adequate public participation. It can be done, and we just really hope that the leaders that we have actually take heed to this call.
Duma, Tshidi speaks about public participation in the budget formulation process. It's quite sad. Like, I think yesterday, the Minister of Finance, when he was addressing the media, was saying that you can't consult everyone on the budget, which I think is reflective of the arrogance of how it's constructed, because we suspect he himself might have received it the morning of, because it seems to be there's a disconnect between the ruling party, the Minister of Finance who belongs to the former ruling party, and National Treasury itself. So when Tshidi speaks about there needs to be a sort of humanitarian budget, a budget that is part and parcel of a consultative process, the minister dismissed that ironically just yesterday. Your thoughts, what are your expectations?
And what he did say that we can't, so we only tell the on the day. We tell the member of cabinet on the day, because there's market sensitive information.
Yes.
I think that we must be transparent, we must be democratic participation, and to hell with market, whatever the markets can say. We as a country, we must debate our budget, and whether it's 2% or we don't want 2%. So it must be genuine participation, like the Budget Justice Coalition talks about all the time. So yeah, I mean, so on the politics, just the last thing I would just say is that, you know, when you look into this, there's a colleague of my friend of mine, Ben Cronin. He says, this is actually not a coalition, because in a coalition you agree up front on policy. So this is actually, in practice, it's if you remember in the beginning, I think the EFF, SACP was saying, no, the ANC must have a minority government with supply and confidence agreement. So what they're saying, what Ben was saying, maybe, is that that's what's happening in practice, you know. So I think what we are going to now with this budget, if they're going to say we want a growth budget, then they might do it on a supply, you know, I just think that the ANC must, maybe the way out of this is to have a minority government, and if the DA wants to support a growth budget or not, then they mustn't, and then other parties must come in and support that growth budget. That is the hopeful me, Duma, but the realistic me thinks we're going to end up with what you said, a 1%, you know, a 1% VAT as a so-called compromise, and different kinds of cuts to spending, a continuation of the suicidal austerity policies, because the austerity policies are political suicide, you know. It's a lose-lose situation for the ANC and the DA, because the DA is going to lose votes to the right, and the ANC is losing votes all the time because on this trajectory, Sinao, unemployment is going to increase by my estimate 500,000 per year. Last year, unemployment increased, the numbers came out, 625,000 increase in unemployed. So my forecast is for an increase of 500,000 a year during this period of this government of neoliberal unity. And we will have an unemployment rate of 44.6% and 2.3 million more unemployed people. So if you add, so we're going to be sitting. Now, what will it take for this government? Will it take 14 million unemployed people for them to say, we can't continue like this? Because on this trajectory, my forecasts are correct, on unemployment. We are now at 11.7, is it 12.3? So if you add, we're heading towards, on this trajectory, more than 14 million unemployed people, 14.6 million unemployed people by the end of this 2029. So what's going to happen in 2029? Jacob Zuma, somebody you've never come across, will come back, and it will be someone you've never heard of running the country, because we can't continue like this. And I don't understand, what will it take for them to stop this insanity? It is insane. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's insanity indeed, but we can't talk all night.
Yeah.
Thank you to independent panelists, Patrick, Tshidi, Duma. We can only hope for the best as we move forward, and across all political lines, across all racial lines, and across all class lines, I think it's important for South Africans to unite and reject the 2% increase. I think it's one of the things that we rarely have ever reached consensus on as a nation. But it's important that we have civil society, trade unions, professionals, professors, academics, and everyone should speak out, should raise their voices against austerity budgeting, but of course as well as an increase in VAT, which is going to affect the purse of the poor the most. Thank you again. Thank you to our viewers for the EFF podcast. That concludes our episode today. Join us next week again as we continue to analyze the political situation in South Africa and interact with important and intriguing guests. Thank you very much, and farewell.
We continue to bring you reaction to the postponement of the budget speech. Joining us now for
postponement of the budget speech.
That the budget was postponed and that government would have further discussions and table a new budget on the 12th of March.
Well, the postponement of budget today has rendered Parliament useless. It has got no authority because budget, whether you agree on it or not, you must bring it here so that it can be debated and ultimately adopted.